Welcome to the life of Caesar, in theory, the life of Vespasian. Ray's not with me today. Honestly, I can't remember why, but I have a guest better than Ray. It's going to be far more entertaining than Ray. Coming to me from Washington, D.C., I believe. Is that right? You're in Washington, D.C., or is your... No, you're in Georgia or
I
somewhere.
am in
Where are you,
Georgia. Yeah, yeah,
Mark?
yeah. Yeah, I'm in the metro Atlanta area
Whereabouts
in
in
Georgia.
Georgia?
In metro
Atlanta.
Atlanta.
I've got it. My father... I was going to say I've got a father-in-law, but I should say my father-in-law lives in Georgia. So shout out to JD. He doesn't listen to the show. But Marc Hyden, let me just jump straight into it. Marc Hyden, author of many history books, including a new one that sort of fits in our wheelhouse at the moment on Emperor Titus, the right hand of Vespasian and son and right hand. But also books on Romulus, books on one of our favourite characters, Gaius Marius, one on Marcus Furius Camillus, who I know nothing about, so I should read that book and learn a little bit about Camillus. But welcome to the show, Mark. I also,
Hey,
I guess the first question, I have two questions straight off the bat. One, how often did you get called hide and go seek as a kid? And two, why write a book about Titus? I'm always fascinated by guys like yourself who write books about these, characters that I think no one outside of us core history nerds cares about. Is it just history nerds writing books for other history nerds to read about?
well, I may be chairman of the board of the History Nerds, so I'm probably in very good company here. Um, well, I just have a long-standing interest in ancient Rome, and it all started my writing with Gaius Marius. Really, I was looking for a book on this really interesting fellow, and I couldn't find anything that had been recently published. So I figured, I write a bunch of op-eds, that I should be able to write a book about him too. And it turns out it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder. So it's you want to be humbled, write a book. But one thing led to
Mm.
another, and I did essentially what is a trilogy of historical biographies, or at least according to the ancient accounts of the first three founders of Rome. But Titus, this is another fascinating character. Now, people fixate on him only being emperor for what, like a little over 2 years or less than 3 years. Um, but he did many other fascinating things, some things that we're seeing the consequences of play out right now in the Middle East. But he's another one of those fellows, like Gaius Marius. There had never been a comprehensive biography ever written about him in English. So I decided to fix that and end his long-term neglect. And here we are. I'm filling in for Ray, so things must be going well.
It's, a friend of mine just sent me the draft of a new book that he's written on Julius Caesar. David Markham, he and I, my first entry into history podcasting was 20 years ago when he and I did a very long series on Napoleon. And my first thought when he said he had written a new book on Julius Caesar was, really? Do we need another book on Julius Caesar? Like, is this some new information that you've uncovered? Like, what's going to be new that hasn't been written about 1,000 times? You've gone the opposite direction, like writing the first book on Titus. So I respect that. But before we get into Titus, let's go back a bit. So, as I told you in my emails, we are relatively early in the story of Vespasian as emperor in our series. We've spent the last couple of years doing the Year of the Four Emperors. We just got to the point where Vitellius ran out of time and Vespasian, not even in Rome yet. He's still in Alexandria, just taking his damn sweet time. But I thought we should go back and build up to Titus by discussing your perspective on the rise of the Flavians, I guess, and what led to it. Because this whole period of the four emperors is just such a bizarre period in the history of Rome. And, we can talk about analogies to the United States as we go. I know you're a conservative very rare for us to have a conservative on this show. I think I've spent the last 10 years upsetting all of the conservatives and the Christians on this show. So you can see can you see the poster behind me? I made a documentary. Oh, I should turn my camera on. I made a documentary of 4 or 5 years ago on the history of Christianity, or the history of the writing of the New Testament, actually. And that, if I had any conservative Christian listeners before that, I'm sure that ended that process. But I'm interesting, I know you've written articles about this. Was it Bibulus you compared Elon to? I
It
seem to
was.
recall.
It definitely was. So I identify as a political conservative, but more in the traditional sense. And you can't work
Right.
in be in my line of work without having really thick skin. But I'm able to work across the aisle. I have libertarian tendencies, so perhaps I'm just homeless, politically homeless. Maybe that's a better way of describing it.
Right. I feel like that too. I don't. Well, I'm not American, but even in Australia, none of the major parties reflect my view on what we should be doing. So I sit nowhere. Um, but it is interesting. Obviously, we get asked this all the time. And going back to 2016, is Trump like Caesar? Is Trump like who is the Roman analog for Trump, for Elon, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm always like, yeah, there isn't one. Like, honestly, um, you know, Trump is not a great general who went out and conquered Gaul for 10 years or any of these sorts of things. So the analogies fall apart quite quickly. But anyway, let's go back. Let's talk about the rise of the Flavians. Where would you start the story? Let's say we're having a coffee, we're having a beer, we're having a scotch. Somebody you're talking to someone, they find out that you're a Roman historian, and they go, "I've always wanted to know about the Flavians." Where would you start the story?
Well, being a loquacious individual as I can be sometimes, I probably go way back. But just, very briefly, not a whole lot is actually known about the Flavians more than, a generation, couple generations before Titus was born. And in fact, they may have traced their ancestry to a humble farmhand who may have had some Gallic background. So this is not a family you would have suspected to rise to power, but they engaged in, tax farming to some degree and banking, and they were able to accumulate quite a bit of wealth and marry their way up a bit too. And finally, this climbing of the ladder worked to Vespasian and his brother Sabinus's benefit. But Sabinus, seemed like he was destined for more greatness than Vespasian. Vespasian didn't even want to enter the cursus honorum to begin. That's the course of honors, path of honors to enter the political realm. He had to be goaded by his mother. So Sabinus is climbing this political ladder, and then Vespasian kind of lackadaisically is doing it, and has plenty of successes, but he also has some notable failures, and has run-ins with the emperors at the time. Caligula had mud thrown at him because he didn't clean the streets well enough, and then in another time when he was in Hadrumintum in northern Africa, he had I believe it was turnips thrown at him. So this is a guy that just keeps having trash thrown at him. So you can't expect this man to become emperor, and in fact. He had almost had a falling out with Nero because he supposedly may have fallen asleep during one of Nero's recitals. But despite that, Nero didn't have him executed, and in fact, Vespasian was with Nero, and Titus was probably also there too in Greece when things just start falling apart in the Holy Land. And that is, in part, what really sets the stage for Vespasian and the rest of the Flavians rise because of the Jewish revolt, and then what happens not long after, which you've already alluded to and you've talked about in your prior episodes, with the Vindex revolt and how this devolved and Rome started to fall apart at the seams.
Hmm. Yeah, fascinating. The as you said, you look at Vespasian's backstory, and he does not seem like a guy who's going to have this historic career and lead the whole family to this epic generational power. He's a bit of a schmo. He's not very, even in the jobs that he got, he didn't do particularly well. So eventually he gets made a general, and again doesn't have any dramatic success as a general, but gets selected. I mean, okay, so let's get to the war against the Jews. Let's talk about that in some detail. You referred to it as the Holy Land, certainly not thought of by the Romans as that at the time. Uh, I've done quite a few episodes on the First Jewish-Roman War. I talked about it in my documentary because obviously it's if you approach the writing of the New Testament from an historical perspective, it's one of the key events around about that time. General consensus of New Testament scholarship is that the first of the Gospels written is the Gospel according to Mark, and it's kind of written, most scholars would say, after the fall of Jerusalem. And in fact, one of the purposes, I believe, of Christianity at the time, or the it wasn't even really Christianity at the time, the Jesus cult at the time, was the answer to the question, well, as Jews, what do we do now that the temple's been destroyed? What's the point? What's the purpose? How do we move on? Talk to me about your perspective of the reasons, the genesis of the First Jewish-Roman War. How did Vespasian end up having to fight the Jews in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're also very right. So I've studied some of the Gospels as well, and Mark was probably the first written, and it's almost exclusively accepted by scholars that it happened after the temple was destroyed. So yes, absolutely right on all points there. Vespasian, as I mentioned, so he's already with Nero. So I think Nero has this thought process going through his head because I'll get to the genesis of the Jewish revolt in a second, but that it, they're up in arms in Judea, Galilee, that region, and he needs to have a general that's competent enough who can put down the revolt. Vespasian ticks that. He needs someone who could never really challenge him, is not particularly charismatic, and doesn't have the lineage that could challenge him, and Vespasian checks that. Then he needs someone. He really needs someone that's kind of nearby. So someone that's not terribly far, could probably hop on a ship or go overland. Is not terribly far. So like we have all these things between that, his background being close and not being considered a threat to the imperial purple. And there we have Vespasian. He's already there. So let's just send him over. So that's essentially, I think, what happened. What went through Nero's mind as he selected Vespasian to head up the war. Now, the genesis of it, it happens a little bit before that. So the Romans and the Jews, they never really got along that well. And a lot of this is absolutely Rome's fault. They weren't very respectful of their traditions. They weren't respectful of their religion. And they didn't really understand it. They thought it was more of a superstition. And they really thought it was bizarre that there were these people who didn't eat delicacies like pork, and they practiced circumcision. So the Romans, they really didn't know what to do, I believe, with the Jews at the time. So there's this long-standing kind of discomfort between the two. And once the most of the Jewish homeland falls under the Romans' purview, they operate in a very heavy-handed manner. And they're not partial to the Jews. And you could see this play out because some Greeks decided to set up an altar outside of one of their temples and mockingly sacrifice some birds. And this was an egregious offense to the Jewish faithful. And, they probably led to some riots. They complained to the local procurator, who was essentially their governor, but was a rung below being known as a governor in the Roman hierarchy. He sides with the Greeks, so that really ticks the Jews off even more, understandably. And then he decides to march into Jerusalem and take 17 talents of wealth, an enormous amount of wealth from the Jewish treasury to pay for back taxes and possibly also help rebuild Rome, because not long before the city had burned down, at least a large portion of it. This was another egregious offense that they just went in and took their money from them. So to mock him, they start passing around a basket, trying to raise money for this procurator as if he was some beggar that really needed money. Well, that really angered him. He was very thin-skinned, so he marches into Jerusalem and kills around, I think, 3,600 Jews that are there. I mean, this is a terrible step. Again, the Jewish people, they try to go to his boss and ask him for help, and he refuses. One thing leads to another at this point, and the Jews realize they cannot get any support from Rome, so they are up in arms. And these rebellions start popping up around Judea and in the Holy Land. Now, I wouldn't consider this a very organized event. This was probably impromptu. These were different warlords that were popping up, and one thing led to another. And then finally, some of the Pharisees tried to gain control of the rebellion and try to set up different governors. And Josephus was one of the ones that they assigned, and became their governor of Galilee, where he fortified all these cities. At least according to his account, his account says that he was a great general. And he would have no reason to lie about that, obviously. He also
No,
claimed
no.
to, he also claimed that he raised about 100,000 men at arms, but scholars think that might have been, around 8,000 instead. So at this point, Nero is aghast. The Near East, the Levant is up in arms. Revolt is spreading, and he needs to get control of it before things really fall apart. And that's when he asks Vespasian to go take care of business. And he is thrilled to have another opportunity to ingratiate himself with the emperor, probably gain a little money since he seemed to have perpetual financial problems, as well as make a bigger name for himself.
Thanks for that background. That's great. I want to push back on a couple of things, though. You talked about the challenges between the Romans and the Jews, and they didn't really get along. But the Romans famously didn't really care what you believed in. Like when they conquered a region, it was like, keep your religion, keep your gods, keep your customs, keep your traditions. We don't really care. Pay your taxes, and if we say you need to provide some cohorts for a legion, do that. Front up if we need to go to war. Don't cause trouble. Keep your nose clean, and just keep sending money to Rome. Really, that's all they cared about. Really, defend the borders. Keep sending money to Rome. And also, if we need you to sacrifice to the Roman pantheon for some reason, because there's a famine or there's a war, we expect you to step up and do your bit to keep the gods happy. And I suspect that was one of the problems that they had with the Jews, and then later on with the Christians, is when they went, no, we're not doing that. They're like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's you're putting the whole empire at risk here by not eating some of the burnt flesh in the sacrificial offering to whoever, Mars or whoever we need to keep happy this week. But there are these interesting, I remember when we were doing Tiberius, a series on Tiberius, there was some, like if you go back to Pompey and Caesar, their relationship with the Jewish people seemed to be relatively benign. I mean, Pompey would, when he conquered the region, would go in and take some stuff out of the temple. But, outside of that, they seemed to be fairly hands-off. Augustus was fairly hands-off. Tiberius, something happened around Tiberius's early years where I couldn't ever really get the backstory on it, but something went down between Tiberius and the Jews. There seemed to be some suggestion of claims of some sort of rebellion or minor infraction, and he had a whole bunch of people deported. Do you know any more about that story?
There's not a whole lot on that. So Tiberius, as well as Claudius, there were these. They banished some Jews from the city of Rome, and the Edict of Claudius. There's debate over whether they're talking about Christians or whether they're actually talking about practicing Jews. But yeah, there was a fraught relationship. And to go back to your point about the Romans, when they would conquer someone, say, "Hey, you keep your gods, worship ours too." That worked really well for pagans. It didn't work very well at all with monotheists, and they struck a very uncomfortable balance with the Jews. So they said, hey, like a lot of the people in the East, we want you to sacrifice to the emperor. Well, the Jews couldn't do that according to their religion. So the agreement they came up with is, well, you'll sacrifice for the emperor. So that was kind of
Well,
the agreement.
sorry, when they took over the region, there was no emperor, really. I mean, I guess Augustus, it sort of got solidified when Herod died, and the Tetrarchy, etc., under Augustus from memory. But Augustus didn't style himself as an emperor either. He was the Principate and all that kind of stuff going on. Later on, that. But in the early stages of Rome's control over the region via Herod or directly under a governor, there was no sacrifice to the emperor. It was just to the pantheon, the Roman pantheon, right? Later on, an emperor sacrifice, sure.
Yeah, yeah, and then of course it does kind of get out of control, especially under like some of the more mad, so-called mad emperors like Caligula and everything. And then it
By
brings
the way,
us to
I I'm a big fan of Caligula and Nero. I think they're hard done by in history. We've spent a lot of years trying to um, resurrect the honor of Caligula and Nero. I just feel bad for Caligula and Nero, really. I mean, they're these kids that grew up in horrible circumstances, horrible pressure, family members all getting killed, and then power and wealth thrust upon them as teenagers. No guidebook, no rule book, no real training in how to handle that level of wealth and power. They're like Michael Jackson. You're a child star and you're fabulously rich. All right, go. Off you go. Have fun. And they're like, what? No, I can't handle it. And they just want to have fun and party. And Nero just wants to be an actor. And Caligula just wants to have fun and race and sleep with lots of
cameras and get
beautiful
away from
women.
all the Epstein news. But he is just a complete joke. And Cheryl, I totally agree with you.
Where's that coming from?
Yeah,
Did you
only
hear
the
that?
mob pleads the fifth. DJT. Yeah, I mean, this guy. One of the
Oh, it was Twitter. I had X open because I was catching up on your X feed, and some video on X started playing. That's weird. Sorry about that. I thought I was
well,
hearing your thoughts going
no,
through your
now we're
head
gonna
then for a second.
we've got to go from Caligula to Epstein now. So we're getting ready
Epstein.
to, it's
Oh,
getting
it's
ready to be
perfect.
real.
Really. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's more like Tiberius's sex palace on Capri, Epstein's Island. Anyway, sorry, get back to I interrupted you on the Caligula and Nero thing. The mad emperors, as you said. Yeah, so the Jews sacrificing to emperors.
Yes, well, and then of course we know that Caligula wanted to erect a statue of himself, on the Temple Mount, possibly inside the actual temple. And so this is just a long string of offenses that really the Jews have had to put up with. And then by Nero's time, between the brigandage that's happening, economic troubles, and then the heavy-handed approach from the Roman procurators and governors, they've had enough. They want to be secure their independence and not live just under a client king. They want to be secure in their independence.
And that's part of what my documentary covered was this exploration of the intertestamental period in Judaism when you kind of have these groups that vaguely think that the Messiah is going to come, the Messiah is going to rise up and conquer the oppressors of Judaism, which of course at this time is the Roman Empire. They'd had a series of oppressors over the last 400 years, give or take. And we see this in the first Jewish-Roman war. We see this internecine warfare between the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the different messianic wannabes that think that they're the one, or their followers think they're the one that's going to overthrow the Romans. But from the Roman perspective, the Jews are the weird ones, right? It's the Jews are weird. These monotheists, from a Roman perspective, are not only weird that they just don't worship all the gods like a good Greco-Roman does, but they're very they're very, they believe they're the chosen people. You know, we're the chosen ones with a single God that worships us and protects us. And they're like, really? We conquered you in like 3 seconds. So this is your powerful God that you think is great? Like, where is he? Why is he not protecting you from us if he's so good? You should come and worship our gods. Our gods are obviously much more powerful because we conquered you and everyone else as far as the eye can see. And the Jews wouldn't get on board. And then when they're saying you need to sacrifice and the Jews refuse, it's kind of heresy wasn't a Roman thing, but the modern, if you had a modern theocracy, okay, I won't talk about current state of the United States, but if you have a theocracy and people aren't doing what they're supposed to do and worshipping the gods in the right way, then they're the ones that are the problem, not the other way around. And at this point, the Jews were part of the Roman Empire. They were supposed to get on board and worship the state gods and worship it in the right way to protect the state, keep the state safe.
Yeah, and the Roman religion, well, if you can even call it that, it was paganism. So they believed it was really communal in nature. So everyone had to take part. You didn't have to believe in it, but you had to take part, because what if Zeus is looking down and he sees your neighbor Bob and he's not really pulling his weight on his sacrifices? You know, it can really tick off Zeus, and he's going to take it out on all of Rome. So everyone needs to do their part, even if they don't buy into it, to ensure that they're safe. And the Jews, they were not going to buy into a system like that.
You see that in the persecutions a couple of hundred years later, Diocletian, those sorts of things, when you read some of the Christian accounts of the persecutions, the so-called persecutions, where you have Christians brought in front of a procurator or something, and they're like, listen, just eat the burnt meat. I don't care what you do. I don't care what you believe. Just eat the damn meat and we can all go home. I don't want to have to kill you. I mean, I didn't wake up this morning and go, I'm going to kill some Christians today. I got real things I have to get done, but the emperor says you need to eat the meat. Just eat the damn meat and we can all go home and get on with our lives. And they're like, no. You can see these governors are like, come on, dude. Seriously? Really? It's delicious. Eat the meat. Eat the damn meat. And they won't do it. So yes, I think from a Roman perspective, they were just weird. It was a weird sort of fringe cult that had been around a long time, but the Romans couldn't make sense of it. So let's get back to the first Jewish-Roman war. Okay, yeah, so the Jews were offended by different things that emperors and procurators were doing. But there was this sort of messianic component to it too, wasn't it? There was these groups of, let's say, militia, from a modern perspective, these militia that were looking for an excuse, any excuse to motivate the people to rise up and overthrow the oppressors. And it was, as I explored in my documentary, there was no real single version of the truth in terms of what the Messiah was going to appear as. Part great warrior in the style of King David, part spiritual leader, part something else. Like, there was lots of different versions of what the Messiah would look like, but there was this idea that someone would rise up like a King David, overthrow the oppressors, and they would all get behind it, and it would all be great, and everyone would worship Yahweh, and there would be peace, and the Jews would conquer the world, and it didn't come to pass. They picked the wrong moment to have a crack at their oppressors.
And even before this, I mean, there were, as you've alluded to, there were several alleged messiahs popping their head up. So in what we now know is the Holy Land, and there was in this time, and then afterward, even with like the Bar Kokhba war, it was as well. So this is a recurring theme, but they wanted their independence, and many of these people were steadfastly dedicated to this. I mean, when Vespasian was laying siege, I think it was to Jotapata, they captured one of the insurgents or rebels, whatever you want to call them. And no matter what they did to this man, torture him and slowly kill him, he refused to aid the Romans. He was dedicated to his people and to the cause, and supposedly he even died with a smile on his face.
Yeah, and we see that again under the persecutions of Diocletian. A lot of this martyr syndrome. A lot of and even a lot of the Christian leaders at the time were writing to Christian communities saying, "Don't do it. Don't willfully have yourself executed. That's not in anyone's best interests." But it was sort of there was like a death cult thing going on. So let's get back to Vespasian. So you were talking about why he was sent to Judea in the first place. Before that, he'd had sort of a minor military career in the invasion of Britannia. He'd spent some time in North Africa, but really no great, outstanding military victories under his name in either of those. He got himself a consulship, so he must have done something worthwhile, but really, he seems to have been a relatively inauspicious military leader. And then even the Jewish-Roman War, I mean, it's important to us today from an historical perspective, but at its time, I don't really think most Romans would have paid very much attention to it. It's a fringe province that is full of weird people with these weird beliefs. They're causing some trouble. We sent some guys in to shut it down. Again, it doesn't really seem like it's building him up to be the chosen one. But then we get to the year of the 4 emperors, and he gets handpicked by, I think, his sons, is my take on it. In the way I portrayed it in our Vitellius and Vespasian series was like, the sons are like, listen, it's obviously up for grabs right now. Anyone can be emperor. Like, why not you? Like, if anyone can get the top job, look, would be good for us if, you're the guy on the throne. But I can't pick apart the rationale really for putting Vespasian up for the top job outside of, well, why not him? Have you got a different perspective on why Vespasian ends up being a claimant for the throne in 69?
Yeah, I mean he is the guy. I mean he's the one that's standing and has a bunch of troops. But to go a little bit further back, so he comes in with maybe 60,000 troops under his command, including a lot of local auxiliaries. But there's 3 legions in there, and he, along with his son, who is the head of the 15th Legion, start laying siege to all these cities in Galilee. They slowly subdue a lot of the Jewish homeland, and then all the stuff goes crazy with the Vindex revolt, and Galba claims to be emperor. And Vespasian seems very happy to get along with whoever the Senate appoints. He administers the oath in support of Galba, and even sends his son to go meet with him, but Galba gets killed by Otho before he can reach there. And then there's the whole Vitellius issue. So there's two claimants at that point, and Titus doesn't know if he should continue to Rome. I mean, he could end up being a hostage to one of the two, and he doesn't know which one his father would prefer. So he heads back home, but not back home, back to the front. And before he does, he stops and talks to a priest and kind of hints that he's thinking about having his dad try to claim the imperial purple. And the priest says, things are looking good. Of course, they're very vague in their omens and what they predict. And Titus hurries along and kind of tells Vespasian what he would do. He thinks that he should throw his hat into the ring. And really, after Otho kills himself, that really opens it up, because for some reason, at least what we're told from pro-Flavian propagandists, is that Vitellius was just such a disgusting, terrible person, bereft of any sort of morals, that we just can't have Rome in the clutches of a man like this. Someone with integrity must take the throne. And Vespasian, is standing there, and his army apparently demands that he do it, or else they'll kill him, which is complete theater, of course. Like, these were very loyal legionaries. They wouldn't threaten to kill their commander over something like this. So if this happened, it was pre-planned political theater. And in fact, you can see this because his troops acclaimed him emperor, but 2 days before, in Tiberius Alexander in Alexandria, his troops declare for Vespasian. So they had planned everything out. It's just someone jumped the gun or was a little bit late. But why was it Vespasian? He was popular, or at least popular enough in the East. He was able to get 14 legions to swear to him. But really, it kind of looks like it probably would have been between two people. So Tiberius Alexander was actually Jewish, so he wouldn't have been able to be emperor. So that leaves maybe the Syrian governor, Mucianus, or Vespasian. So Mucianus, as I understand, was gay. He did not have any heirs, and he was happy to kind of play in the background. So that leaves Vespasian, and he's happy to do it, and he cobbles together this intricate plan to take power. And I know you know this well, but for your listeners who may not be as familiar with it, it really hinged on cutting off grain to Rome. So he was going to send troops to Rome to fight Vitellius and whatever troops he had left over, and then he was going to go, Titus as well as Vespasian, to Egypt to sit on the grain dole, or sit on grain and not let it go to Rome, so that they would starve. So even if they don't win the battles against Vitellius, they're going to be starving and they're going to have to relent. This is a fantastic plan. Now, I'm going to pause for a second. Cameron, this is the Leroy Jenkins moment. Are you familiar with this? So
no, it's Leroy Jenkins.
So this is an internet meme from years ago where it's a screen grab of these people playing a video game of some sort. Yes.
Oh, no. Sorry, I was thinking someone else. Okay, keep going.
So these characters are all sitting around in this live action game, and they're talking about their plan to win. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of them planning, this guy yells his own name. He says, "All right, let's do it." And then he yells his own name, Leroy Jenkins, and he rushes in to fight while they're still trying to plan. This is exactly what happened in Rome. Primus decides to just rush in there and take on Vitellius before Mucianus is even over there. And he's actually very successful, unlike the Leroy Jenkins moment. So this is just an ancient account that's just like something similar to what happened in the modern era.
Right. So you said Mucianus was gay. I never picked that up. The interesting thing, like, we've talked about the fact that Mucianus and Vespasian didn't really get along very well. There seemed to be tension between the two of them until he decides to back Vespasian's play for the throne, and then he becomes he's his right-hand man in the early stages, but while Titus isn't in Italy yet. So where did you pick up the fact that he was gay?
Now, those are secondary sources that have reported on it, and I've seen it more than once. So it's implied. I haven't seen it in the ancient accounts. I've seen it from secondary accounts. But how did this really come together? Because they were rivals. So you have Vespasian with all these troops in a bordering region to Syria, where Mucianus is, and of course, there's going to be a rivalry. So in the middle of one of the sieges that Vespasian was overseeing, he sends his son to go to Syria and meet with the governor, and they have apparently a long discussion, and they become fast friends. So there's a lot of things that you can say about Titus. Some people have questioned, including myself, how great of a commander was he? What was his really what were his big successes early on in the war? He was an incredibly skilled diplomat, and I think he was exceptionally charismatic. He was betting with Berenice, the Jewish queen, and he wins over Vespasian's rival to such a degree that he's willing to back his claim in what was really treason at the time. So Titus is that link, and he used his power of charisma to be able to do it.
Power of charisma. All right. So you were talking about the general Vespasian strategy, which was to, I think, try to avoid a civil war as much as possible. He wanted to avoid any more bloodshed, just figured he would starve out Vitellius with sitting on the grain supply. And then, of course, that doesn't go to plan. He has some of his underlings, one in particular, who says, you know what, there's no glory in me just sitting here and waiting. I want to go and get the fight on. But it's this bizarre story then where Vespasian is able to take the throne without moving. He sits in Alexandria for the entire period, gets declared emperor by the Senate, and basically just sits the whole thing out. He's not a general. He's not on the battlefield. Say what we will about Galba and Otho and even Vitellius to a lesser extent, but at least they were somewhat involved in their own civil wars. He's just sitting it out in luxury in Alexandria. It's the most incredible story. He has to do nothing. A bit like I did a post the other day talking about China and China's rise to being the world's leading superpower. They don't have to do anything. They're just sitting there and letting the US tear itself apart. They're just sitting and waiting. That's literally what he did. He just sat there and wakes up one day and is told he's emperor. Like, isn't that weird? I mean, the whole period of the 4 emperors is weird, but that is particularly weird.
Yeah, when you go into this not knowing about Roman history and you're like, okay, Vespasian rises to power, you expect these massive battles, like you've heard from prior wars in which he's leading from the front or something along those lines, and it's really not like that. It's this general who had some Pannonian legions that decided to rush in there before anyone else. Now, I think that Vespasian was dedicated to meeting Vitellius's legions, his troops, and that's why the Syrian governor was coming overland at the head of troops. But he wasn't ready for a fight just yet. It's just one of his underlings decided to jump the gun and do it himself. And some of the reason, as you've mentioned, is he wanted glory. Primus wanted glory, but also he had a grudge against Vitellius. He backed Otho, and before he could reach Otho to help him, the guy killed himself. So Primus needed Vespasian, and he also wanted to probably take some revenge against Vitellius. And then we have Vespasian just hanging out in Alexandria, and then, I guess you're emperor now. So it really worked out. I'm hoping one day I wake up and I'm told I'm emperor too, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah. Yeah, you kind of think of Constantine and the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and all this sort of stuff, these two generals with big factions fighting each other, etc., but he just sits there and waits for it all to come to pass. Okay, so he's made emperor. Now let's talk about Vespasian as the Messiah. I talked about messianic wannabes earlier on. I have touched on this a little bit in our series. When you read Josephus and some of the signs that he talks about, that Vespasian was the chosen one, there was this suggestion that people in Alexandria, we have Vespasian healing the lame and healing the blind with his spittle and his touch and pulling off all of these miracles. So getting back to talking about connections between the New Testament and way back in our Julius Caesar series, we talked about the similarities between Julius Caesar and the Christ story, forgiving his enemies, getting betrayed, his spirit going up to heaven after 3 days, and him becoming a god, and all these sorts of things. And also Augustus being the son of a god, and Augustus being deified, and all these sorts of parallels with some of the motifs that were built up around Jesus by the early Christians. Here we have similar stories, and I don't think these are very well known. The parallels between Vespasian's messianic credibility, according to Josephus, and the Jesus story, and then trying to work out who's copying who here, because when you look at when Josephus was writing, when Mark, or whoever wrote the Gospel according to Mark, was writing, the overlap of the stories here. How familiar are you with the Josephus Vespasian Messiah stories, and what the timing of those is compared to the depictions in Mark and Matthew and Luke?
This is definitely not my expertise, but I mean, I know that there are theories out there that talk about the Flavians creating Christianity, and then they point to different parallels. And you mentioned the spittle in the eye, and the touching his heel, and healing someone of whatever lame limb they had. And then there are other episodes and issues that they try to point to that shows that one, perhaps they tried to create Christianity. It's not a theory I subscribe to. That, or perhaps they were trying to present themselves in more of a messianic light, and perhaps maybe they would be able to win over some of the Jewish faithful in that way, and quell some of these revolts. I'm not a strong adherent to some of those theories. To be perfectly candid, I mean, I wrote a pretty scathing one about Titus inventing Christianity not long ago, which that's something we can talk about on a different episode. But there are some of those episodes. But I do also want to note that while it's pretty widely reported on the spitting in the eye and then touching his heel to a lame person, I think it was Tacitus that kind of poo-pooed the idea of it. He's like, yeah, they reported on it. However, here's the reasons why those people were actually healed. So he tries to present a non-miraculous answer for how Vespasian was able to allegedly cure these people.
Yeah, for the record, I don't buy the theory that Christianity was invented by the Romans to control the Jews either. And you know, the mainstream scholarship poo-poos that whole thing. I do get the impression from Tacitus, and I love Tacitus, by the way. Tacitus has a lot of problems, but I do love reading Tacitus. Like, he is so dry and funny and scathing at different times. But I have the comparison here. I just dug up my notes from an episode that we did a long time ago. This is from the Gospel of Mark. It says, they came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands upon him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Tacitus says, at Alexandria, a commoner whose eyes were well known to have wasted away, on the advice of Serapis, whom this superstitious people worship as their chief god, fell at Vespasian's feet, demanding with sobs a cure for his blindness, and imploring that the emperor would deign to moisten his eyes and eyeballs with the spittle from his mouth. Another man with a maimed hand, also inspired by Serapis, besought Vespasian to imprint his footmark on it. Now, this happens in 69. As we said earlier, Mark's gospel is thought to have been written around 69, 70. So Tacitus is writing a few decades later, but we're assuming he's writing it from contemporary sources that talk about. But the perspective we get from the Vespasian stories is that Vespasian was very uncomfortable with all of this. He laughed it off and didn't want to participate in this, what I'm sure he thought to be a bizarre, culty religious request. But then the insistence of the crowd made him hesitate, and he was worried that refusing to participate would make him look snotty. But then if he did these things and nothing happened, he would, not be whatever they thought he was. And these people obviously aren't talking about him as being the Jewish Messiah. They're from the cult of Serapis, even though there was a big Jewish community in Alexandria, obviously. You mentioned Tiberius Alexander before. And I remember Ray and I did a long series on Alexander and the Diadochi years and years and years ago. God, many, many years ago. But I remember talking about how Ptolemy basically invented the cult of Serapis. It was a way of trying to merge together some sort of syncretized version of Egyptian cult and Isis cult and Greek cults. But so anyway, Vespasian goes ahead with it. He asks doctors whether or not he should do this, and they give him some, look, if you wipe the dirt out of his eyes with your spit or whatever, it should help this. And he does it, and they get cured, and then Josephus supposedly takes this as signs that he is the Messiah. But it's also confusing because, as I said earlier, there were, in the intertestamental period, this post-Christian idea that we all grew up with, that we're used to, where the Messiah performs miracles, would not have been a commonly held view in Judaism in the first century, because that's not, Jews didn't believe that the Messiah was, a miracle worker or a god or the son of a god any more than all Jews were sons of God. For most first century Jews who wanted a Messiah, as best as I understand it from talking to scholars over the years, it would have been more like King David. King David wasn't a miracle worker. I mean, maybe killing Goliath with a slingshot was a bit of a miracle, but he was just a human. He was just a guy who was chosen to lead his people, and you had some, he was favored by Jehovah, by Yahweh, to lead his people. So that's this weird thing. So we see in Josephus, who's not a Christian, but the suggestion that Vespasian, because he is performing miracles, is the Messiah. Also a great, in Josephus's view, military leader, although, I mean, I don't think he had, fighting the Jews in Judea wasn't that big of a job. They weren't like this great military force that had been out conquering lands for the last 10 generations. They were an oppressed people and had been for a long time. So I don't know, I'm rambling here, but do you get my point? Like this the whole miracle stories being associated with Vespasian, I find really, really bizarre on several levels.
You don't see a lot of this for other emperors. I can't think of one for a prior emperor that this really happened.
No.
But there are some theories that Josephus mocked Christianity. And if that is the case, or if you wanted to poke fun, or if you subscribe to the theory that he was in on faking Christianity, this would have been him mocking it. There's some different theories around this. So if he was trying to make fun of the Christian faith, this might have been leading to that. And when people talk about Josephus doing this sort of thing, people also point to the terrible episode of a woman named Mary that actually has to is starving in Jerusalem, and it ends up killing and consuming her child. A terrible story, but it's in Josephus. I also think we need to keep in mind that Josephus was the Flavians were his benefactors. So he had a vested interest to make them look fantastic. And they gave him an allowance, most likely. They gave him land in Judea, even got a room in Vespasian's house. So very favored. Yeah. And some of these other ancient writers, too, were bankrolled by the Flavians, most likely. So we talked earlier about Caligula and Nero being looked at as just terrible, which they probably were pretty bad emperors, but they got bad PR. The Flavians, well, not Domitian, but Titus and Vespasian, great PR.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about Josephus and the Christians, I mean, leaving aside the testimonium, which obviously has some problems, he seems, he acknowledges the existence of a Christ cult, a Jesus cult, and there are some issues with both mentions of that he has. But he's writing the Jewish War around about 75, we think. So not that long after these events took place. 5-6 years after this took place, and he's probably writing it for a period of time, before it gets published. Again, Mark is probably written around this time, but how much distribution did, my take on the way that the gospel according to Mark, why it was written and how it was distributed, it wasn't published by Random House and on every book street corner. Like, this was the Jesus cult in this period seems to have been a mystery religion. In many ways, it was underground, wasn't really something that was being talked about a lot. In fact, one of the stories I told in my documentary is, which I think is very telling, the first time Jesus ever appears in a gospel and says anything in a gospel is in Mark 4:12, when he is with a mob, I think it's in Galilee, and then he gets on a boat with his disciples and he goes out in the sea. And to paraphrase Mark, he says, I'm not going to tell the people the truth, because if I told the people the truth, they'd want to get saved. I'm only going to tell you the truth. To everyone else, I'm going to talk in parables. It's the first thing Jesus says in any of the Gospels. It's the first thing that Mark has about anything Jesus has to say. And so the question I always have is, well, what's Mark trying to tell us here? Why does he say Jesus isn't going to tell anyone the truth? He's only going to talk in parables. Seems to suggest that he's saying everything I have Jesus say from this point on, you should take as a parable. The second question I had for all the scholars when I did my documentary is, well, what is the truth that he's telling the disciples that he's not telling the people? Because he never goes on to say that. And they said, we don't know. It's called the Markan secret. We don't know what the secret was that he was going to tell the people. The only question is, why didn't he want the people on the land to get saved? Isn't that the whole point? Is he's there to save them? Why doesn't he want them to get saved? Anyway, point being that it seems like this is a mystery cult, mystery religion that started to write stuff down, which you weren't supposed to do, and then it kind of leaks out over time. And then when you see the historical progression of the Gospels, when you read Mark, Jesus doesn't appear to be that special. He's just a guy who is trying to tell people that the end of times is coming. By the time you get to Matthew and Luke, written 15, 20 years later, he's starting to become a little bit more powerful. By the time you get to John, written another 20 years later, he's literally saying, I am God. So there's this progression of the evolution of the depiction of Jesus in these gospels over decades. But getting back to Josephus and Mark, like the point I'm trying to make is I don't think Mark was very well read by the time Josephus was writing. So the question then is, would he have heard of these miracle stories? Were these miracle stories already well known? Were people hearing about, oh, there was this guy and he was able to cure the blind and heal the lame, and Josephus was taking that? Or did the stories start with Vespasian and Mark picked them up and said, oh, no, that wasn't Vespasian, that was Jesus who did those things? But as you said before, like there are no other miracle stories being associated with emperors that I can think of. So it's just such a bizarre thing for Josephus and Tacitus to be writing about Vespasian at all. Anyway, I don't know what my point is there. It's just as bizarre. It's weird.
I think Suetonius may have also mentioned that episode as well. And
he does. Yeah,
you're right. So the Gospel of Mark probably finalized around about 70 AD. Then if you look at Matthew and Luke, probably between 80 and 100, and then John, gosh, I don't know, maybe about 120 or so AD. However, there are scholars mostly agree that Gospel of Thomas, the Sayings Gospel, actually predates Mark, and then there's also Q source. So there were pre-existing, you could try to call them a gospel. I mean, it depends what your opinion really is, that pre-existed Mark. So there were the prior ones. And you asking about, well, would Josephus have known about miracle stories? I mean, this is kind of a theoretical exercise, but I'm of the mind that miracle stories are kind of hard to keep secret. So would he have heard if he knew about Christians, which the testimonium, I think most people reject that as a later interpolation, but there is evidence that Josephus probably knew about Christianity. So if he did, it's possible that he knew about those accounts. But again, this is it's a bit of a hypothetical exercise.
Yeah, but just like any sort of miracle stories being attributed to a Jew or a Roman is just it's strange, but particularly the Vespasian side of it, this messianic. So you mentioned that Josephus was working eventually for the Flavians, and we have to keep in mind, as this is what I say about the bad PR of Caligula and Nero and even Claudius to an extent. A lot of stuff, a lot of the histories that we know existed disappeared. We don't have access to lots of the sources from that period to give us different perspectives on these guys. There's a certain version of the truth that has come down to us over the last 2,000 years, and that's all we have to go with. And a lot of them are not flattering in talking about these guys. Even Tacitus isn't flattering, but does try and provide a little bit more perspective on them. So we've got to Vespasian. He's emperor. He is the Messiah, according to Josephus anyway. And what happens then between him and Titus? Bridge the gap for us. Jumping ahead a little bit for our audience in the storyline, but that's okay. How would you depict Vespasian's time on the throne? Was he worthy of the throne? More worthy, less worthy than the Galbarotho Vitellius and the Julio Claudians?
Just to jump back, so back on the miracles, there's theories that Vespasian knew that he had no real claim, no hereditary claim to the throne. So really he tried to style himself like Augustus. Who disliked Augustus in ancient Rome? So he wanted to style himself after that. And perhaps also Josephus, who was probably in his pay at some point, said, we really need to make him look worthy of the throne. And what better way to do it than make him a miracle worker? This guy, he may not be a son of a god like some of the later emperors might have claimed to be, but he had some sort of something supernatural about him. But enough on that one. So to answer your question, again, Vespasian benefited from great press. But I don't know if it's all deserved. I think most of it probably is. But before he goes to Rome from Alexandria, he kind of hangs out there for a while. And there's a question of what was he doing? Why didn't he go to Rome and just go sit on his throne? And the answer seems to be there were a lot of enemies that he had, and he needed to have them murdered. Or at least he thought he needed to have them murdered. But he wanted to keep his hands clean. So he let his underlings take care of business, either exile or wipe out some of these people that might cause him problems once he comes in. So then when he comes in, he can be this magnanimous, very peaceful, merciful leader. And, he does come across as that kind. But once he's there, he sees Rome is just in terrible shape financially. And even resorts to raising taxes, a urine tax later on in his imperial tenure. And when Titus finds this kind of disgusting and was not as pro-tax as he was, he holds out some of the money he acquired from it, and he asks him if it smelled, the money. And Titus says, well, no. And then, Vespasian famously says, and I paraphrase, yet it comes from piss. So he, is kind of this witty guy that was supposedly pretty merciful, and he gets Rome back on its financial footing. And he starts to build the Colosseum and do all these things that really he's looked at as one of your quintessential emperors. But before he left Alexandria, he actually assigned Titus to, Titus becomes Caesar. So he's the heir to the throne, and he shares a consulship with his father in absentia. And eventually he's given all these other powers like tribunician potestas and imperium. But he also assigns him to finish off the Jewish war. And really at that point, the main thing that was left was Jerusalem, as well as some holdouts like Machaerus, Herodium, and famously Masada. And that's kind of where things are at when they split.
So his his emperorship lasts about 10 years. And as far as I'm aware, we don't know a lot about what he did. You hit some of the high points, Colosseum, but there's very little surviving in the sources about what he really did. He erected the statue of Apollo. It was supposed to be a statue of Nero. We know Suetonius says that there were lots of conspiracies against him. We don't even know many of those. I think we know one that happened late. There's some expansion in Britain, but really, for such an important figure, very little survives about his reign. And I often wonder when, in later years, in the so-called Dark Ages, when Christians were determining what to save and what to abandon and, what they just couldn't be bothered copying. Ray and I also do a series on the Renaissance, by the way, and we did many, many episodes at the beginning of our Renaissance series talking about why there had to be a Renaissance in the first place and how everything was lost and why it was lost in that sort of 1,000-year period between sort of Constantine and the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. There's just, for one reason or another, deliberately or accidentally, we just don't know a lot about the reign of Vespasian. Do you have any theories on why that is?
Mainly because it's Suetonius. That's where we get a lot of the information about his reign, and he writes a very Cliff's Notes version, and it's generally not even it's not even chronological. It's thematic, so it makes no sense. If you really want to look at it like that. But you can read between the lines. We know about Agricola, eventually going through parts of the UK and taking care of business there. We also know that there are several provinces that Vespasian added. Now, a lot of these might have been formerly client states that he just enrolled formally as provinces. But there is really a dearth of evidence, and I think it just goes to these are the only sources that we have left. It's if all you have is Plutarch's Lives about, some Marius or Sulla, I mean, there's only so much you can really know. Although it's much worse if you're having to rely on Suetonius, who was a bit of a hack when it came to a historian, but he's what we've got.
Yeah, and I don't even, I don't think Suetonius considered himself a historian. One of the things we've talked about a lot in our shows over the years, going way back to Alexander and Caesar, is the professional historian, as we think of them today, didn't really exist back then. There were some guys that had a crack at it and did the best they could, and I think Tacitus is one of those. He took it somewhat more seriously, but Suetonius is trying to write stories about morals and values and what makes good people good and bad people bad. And sadly, it's just one of the few things from that era that has survived. What about the sources for Titus? When you were starting your book on Titus, how much did you have to work with?
A lot of it's about the same situation. You're looking at Cassius Dio, you're looking at Suetonius, a little bit from Tacitus, and then you have Josephus, and that's in large part what you really have here. And part of the reason that you have just not a lot out there, and this is just a theory that I have, and it's similar with the last several months of Titus's life, and obviously several years under Vespasian. If there's not a bunch of big wars, it's kind of quiet. No one wants to report on an emperor that's just hanging out, having banquets, enjoying peace and prosperity. I mean, there's only so much you could write about that. So that's probably in part the situation that we have. But we know that there were developments. As I mentioned, the Colosseum, what was happening in the modern UK. So Rome was busy, but it just so happened to not all of it was noteworthy, I guess, to Suetonius.
Big question I wanted to ask you is, with the research that you did on Titus, was he in the Epstein files?
We'll know when they ever get released. I'm joking, of course. I'm not following the whole Epstein thing too closely. They said there's not a list. I don't know if there's a list. I don't know, not my policy area. So we'll find out if Titus is in there once there's a discovery, I guess.
All a hoax. Okay. Well, give us the quick. People are obviously going to go and buy your book and read your book on Titus, but give us the Cliff Notes version on Titus's few years as emperor, highlights and lowlights.
Yeah, he had one of the busiest couple years as emperor that just about anyone had. The Colosseum is finished. He finishes the imperial baths. There's a fire of Rome. There's a plague. Vesuvius blows its top. Agricola is still busy in the UK, and he's dealing with assassination attempts. This is a person that is very busy and manages it all with great aplomb, and he seemed to kind of transform himself, because before becoming emperor, I mean, he shared power with his father, but he was also one of the Praetorian prefects, and he was kind of a tyrannical enforcer that was very quick to murder anyone that may impugn his father or even think about harming him. But he changes and becomes this kind of loving father figure, if you will, as an emperor. And who knows what would have happened if he lived longer? But he died, according to some people, under mysterious circumstances. Really, it seems more like it was malignant malaria as opposed to Domitian killing him or anything. But he dies, and he joins the many deities in the pantheon, and gets to join his father and be worshipped for many years to come.
And I believe there were suggestions that his younger brother Domitian was plotting against him.
Yeah, so we talk about the good and the bad press. We've talked about that several times, and the ancient authors were aggressively opposed to Domitian, and anytime they could make him look bad, they were going to take that opportunity. And I think they saw Titus, a good emperor, Domitian, a bad emperor, and he had motive to kill Titus to succeed him to the throne. So therefore, let's say that he plotted against him. And there are the reports, but there's also the coins showing Titus and Domitian holding hands and ruling together over Rome. Although a lot of times when they had coins like that announcing peace and prosperity, often it was the direct opposite. But there doesn't seem, from my perspective, I think Domitian was probably just he was probably innocent in any sort of real plotting. And I don't think he had anything to do with his brother's death, even though he did benefit from it.
And Titus was like, what, 40, 41 when he died?
He was in his early 40s, so when it hit him, he probably, and he died quick. He was on his way to vacation in the countryside, and a fever struck him, and he looks to the sky outside of the litter he's riding in, and he kind of bemoans to the gods, why would this happen to me at the height of my power? And he thought he was a virtuous guy too, and quite young, relatively speaking. I like to think that's quite young, at least. And then he's struck down, in a matter of days or hours after that, and then we get Domitian, and things go a little sideways for Rome.
Is that going to be your next book? What's your next book going to be on, Mark?
I think there's a lot of choices. I've started working. There's we've touched on the year of the four emperors. There's years of many other emperors. So hopefully I'll churn something out. But I am very blessed and happy to say that I have a 10-month-old girl, and she makes it a little bit difficult to keep up writing at the pace that I have been accustomed to doing so.
Oh, well, congratulations. That's great. Well, listen, I guess I should let you go. It's been really fun to chat and get your perspective on all of these things. Congratulations on the books. I'm looking forward to reading the one on Titus. I just don't want to jump too ahead in my timeline, but no doubt when we get to Titus in our series, we'll be talking to people about what you've said in your book. I do recommend, I've been reading the one on Marius, which is great. Big fan of Marius. It all goes back to, well, I always say, I asked you that question before and you said, well, you have to go back a bit, like where did it all start? And I always start with the Gracchi. Well, we have to go back to the Gracchi and talk about reform in Rome, and then we talk about Marius and Sulla and get up to Julius Caesar. I always say, Julius Caesar didn't start the fire, but he just decided, you know what, enough's enough. It's time to make Rome great again. Murga, I think he called it, the original MAGA. But it's always great to talk to another Roman history nerd, Mark. So thanks for taking the time to come on and gasbag with me today.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And you started off earlier saying that there's a lot of conservatives and Christians that you've really ticked off. And you know what? You've got a fast friend in one right here. In fact, I'm gonna have to come down there and do some scuba diving with you in Australia. So I hope you got a couch I can sleep on.
Absolutely, got a spare bed and everything. All right, Mark. I'll look forward to it. Thanks for chatting.
All right, thanks so much.